Welcome on in, Golf fans. It's your boy Gsluke here with our DFS and betting live stream for this week's RSM Classic. Gonna make sure you're ready for all of your exposure this week. Handling any of your questions down there in chat. A look at the weather report, how to handle that over the first few days, and of course, a few things over there on the DFS side, a few props on Underdog and Prize Picks. Whatever you guys want to talk about, it's your time here for it. So first off, I want to say welcome on in wherever you guys are. Whether you're watching this during the live stream or over there on the replay, we're glad to have you, and hopefully we can make this one a good one for you. We're going to start it off with a look at the weather and what to expect, which isn't going to be hugely impactful when it comes to our process because we do have a relatively tight spread of tee times. If you're not sure how it works at the RSM Classic, well, they're going to have two golf courses in play the first few days. So you got the Seaside course up here at the top, the Plantation course down at the bottom. So even though there are 156 players in the field, the tee times are only about a 2.5 hour spread. So if you're trying to find an edge out there for Showdown, or even out there in terms of your main slate, it's going to come down to really the golf course that they're starting on, not so much when they're actually teeing off. So speaking of that, in the past, you've probably heard a few content creators for this event maybe talk about how the Plantation course is the course you want to play when winds really kick up, but that hasn't necessarily held true. If you take a look at some of the scoring averages the last 3-4 events, it's kind of flip-flopped with which course which actually plays harder when you have that wind. So I think that would come down to temperature. The longer Plantation course might play a little bit harder when the wind kicks up and it's a little bit cooler. And then also that wind direction could have an impact on that as well. So just know that the whole quote unquote edge after going versus one course versus the other has hardly ever really panned out. And usually it's not a huge difference between the two golf courses. So though we can take a look at the forecast here, I'll bring up all 5 actually at the same time. You see that for the first few days, it looks like it's going to be cool for both days and actually a little bit windier than what these players would be hoping for. But there's not a massive difference from Thursday into Friday. So if we take a look at Thursday, it's in that like 9 to 15 mile an hour range. Over here on Friday, it's a little bit more consistent throughout the day, but it's in that 12 to maybe 16, 17 mile an hour range. And most of the models on here, as you can see, are closer to like 14, 15 miles an hour over there on Friday. So maybe a little bit higher wind in the morning over there on Friday than what we have over on Thursday. But because there's only about a 2.5 hour split, and also because you have the two golf courses in play, I don't think that there's anything that we can do for the main slate. So in terms of how I'm playing my lineups, I'm not really accounting for it one way or the other. The one argument that you could make would be to go out there and just blindly stack each wave, just kind of hoping that you get it right. But I will tell you that just looking at some of the data the last 3-4 years, it hasn't really panned out to be more than maybe like a 0.3 to a 0.5 shot advantage at the very most. And you could argue that something like a 0.3 to a 0.5 shot advantage could just be circumstance or come down to coincidence out there with noise. It could be variance one way or the other. Maybe there was a slight advantage because of the prevailing wind that you had that week. It's really hard to say with data that jumbled up. So that's the weather component. We're more so going to focus on game theory this week. We do have a full field. We do have shot length this week, which is going to be super clutch when we talk about Showdown for rounds 2 through 4. When we get on the same golf course for rounds 3 and 4, Showdown, by the way, if you're playing Showdown, I would say that if you're trying to choose between the two golf courses, last year's data would tell you to go out there and play Seaside. But if we go to the year before that, you can see the Plantation course played significantly easier. Worth noting that day one, they had quite a bit of wind. That was, I guess, 2 years ago. They're the 2023A. You can see round 1 on the Seaside course played a whole 0.43 over par on a very windy day. Remember, they played the Plantation course also out there on Thursday. It played 1.79 under par. So if you're playing Showdown tomorrow, I think if you're looking at last year's averages, you might say like, oh, I want to play the Seaside course. It's a par 70 and they played to a -2.4 scoring average. Reality is that when it's windy, it looks like, especially with this data here, that the plantation course is a much easier of the two, which makes sense from the narrative standpoint. Like, it's further inland. I think I agree with that. And it also has more par fives. So when you have those windy conditions, it's harder to score on the shorter par fours. But when you have the 4 par fives, like you have on a par 72, I think that's also why you saw players take a little bit more advantage over there. So if we go back and try and find some more difficult rounds, like round 2 was kind of hard. Over there in 2022, it played 0.94 over par on the Seaside course. And then if we take a look at round 2 over here, it still played over par. So it played 0.68 over par, but it was a lower scoring average than what you had on that same golf course. So just for the sake of completion, let's see if there were any other significantly harder rounds. So like round 1 there in 2021 was also, I would say maybe a little harder. It was closer to even par. And you can see the plantation course that time around was actually the harder of the two. So this is what I mean with the data not being completely conclusive, is you have a few years where the data kind of gets thrown into a blender. I'd say what we saw in 2023, when you had it actually play over par one course and then under par on the other, is what most people would expect. And most people have said in the industry, the prevailing narrative is that the plantation course would be easier. But we do have data points, as I just showed you guys, showing you the exact opposite. So for showdown purposes, I think it's tough to say how it's going to play. I do know, though, that I would probably lean towards plantation just based on the sample size that we have from last 2 years ago. So it's pretty recent when we have this kind of split. And then I do agree with that community sentiment that the further inland course is likely going to play a little bit easier than the one that's actually on the coastline. But some of the stuff from 4 or 5 years ago really throws me off when we go out there and say that. And I'm a big prop guy, as you guys know. That's going to have a big impact on our process out there for round 1. So we're going to circle back on these averages when we get to that a little bit later on. Same thing with the weather. But in terms of your DFS lineups over there in Draftkings, I don't think there's much that we can do other than maybe blindly tailing one wave or the other, which is always tough to do. It's not something that I'm personally going to incorporate, but I think that's the only way to really go about it. Let me bring up our projections. Let's head over to the DFS side. And if you have any specific player questions, feel free to go ahead and throw those down in live chat. Smash the like button if you guys haven't already as well. If you guys are just getting into the live stream here, and hit me up with your player to win this week. So if you guys don't have any specific questions, I get that. Let's feed the algorithm a little bit, try and get this out there to even more people. Hit me up with your winner for this week down there in the live chat, which, by the way, if you guys haven't commented on the DFS preview this week and went with your winner out here for the RSM, make sure to do so, because if you get the winner right, it won't be anything here in the live stream because we already have this other giveaway going along. But if you also missed out over there, make sure to put it on the DFS preview, because if you get the winner, you'll win a free month on my Patreon page. So just make sure that somebody hasn't taken your player before you, as it's first come, first serve when it comes to that. But yeah, make sure to do that as well. And I want to see it down in the live chat too. What's going on, Antonio? Welcome on in. What's going on, Kim? Would I mind showing you some of the top Bermuda grass putters? Sure, I will show you that. We'll do that here in just a minute. We get featured groups and shot tracker. Yeah, dude, it's good. It's gonna be good for Showdown, being able to actually look at some ball strikers. And then the ESPN Plus coverage is godsend. Like it's about time, right? Seaside gets third, and Plantation. I'm not sure what you're saying there. They're only going to play the Seaside course, or I should say Plantation course, for one of the 4 rounds. And the way that they do it, Antonio, is that the first 2 days, if you play Seaside, you're going to play Plantation. The next day, if you start on Plantation, you're going to go to Seaside out there for round number 2. And then rounds 3 and 4, they're only going to use the Seaside course. So you're only going to get 1 round on Plantation over the 4 days. You're going to get 3 rounds on the Seaside course. So most of my experience with the RSM is on Seaside. I've been there for the last 3 years. Not going to be there this time around. It'll be the first time in a while. I'm not going to see it in person. Just focusing on some NFL stuff. If I go out there, obviously it takes away from some of the other content that I'm doing back at home here. So I've seen enough of St. Simon's Island. I'm sure I'll go back at some point. But Seaside course is where you're going to see most of the action going down. So that's 3 of the 4. And Plantation it's only for the first 2 days. You got Dirt McGirt out there as your pick to win. I like it. It's a bold, outside the box kind of play. And hey, for this kind of format, that's exactly what I was hoping for. So yeah, hit me up with those winners down in the chat if you guys haven't already. And make sure to comment on the DFS preview. But let's go through some of the ownership here, and then a few players that I wanted to draw your attention to. So in terms of your showdown and your main slate exposure this week, guys, I think especially for your main slate, you want to be leaning into game theory as much as humanly possible. There are some guys that you can look at for form. So like, for example, Ben Griffin, I pointed him out as one of my conviction plays on Tuesday. Main reason for that is we know the form that he has heading in. He's been playing solid. He also had a top 10 at this golf course. So I think there's a lot of things you could say that would point you to a Ben Griffin. But we have a lot of guys in this field, like a Brian Harmon, like a Siwoo Kim, a Ludwig up top, any of these guys that we really haven't seen at all towards the top end of the board. And it doesn't just stop there. Like a Luke Clanton, we've hardly seen. A Chris Kirk, we've only seen for like maybe an event or two. Matt Wallace has been playing over there on the DP World Tour. And it's not like all of those guys are chalk, but a good amount of them are getting ownership this weekend. I guess what I would say about this kind of event is that when you have all these kind of guys that we haven't even seen playing, that we don't know if they're going to have good form, a lot of which they haven't even played this golf course before, it makes it tough to really want to play any chalk on a week like this, because I think it's going to introduce a lot of variance. I think a lot of the guys that were playing really well towards the end of last year that might look like they have good form, they might be popping in your projections and modeling because of how they finished their season for the actual like regular season. That's been like 3-4 months ago. So like, for example, like a Sepp Straka, a lot of those other guys we've already mentioned, like a Matthew McCarty, he hasn't even been playing all that often. A lot of your stats, a lot of your projections are going to tell you that these are the best plays in this field. And I would really argue against that. I would say that the guys that have actually played well the last 3-4 weeks that have some momentum heading in are, in my opinion, the best plays that we have on this kind of slate. So what I think you guys should do to kind of just make it in a digestible, actionable tip to go out there and build lineups is just be a little bit more different this week than usual. If you're going out there, you're taking 2-3 pivots and GPP lineups, I think this is a week to push the envelope a little bit and maybe take that to 3-4 pivots that you're playing in lineups. You can still have the rogue piece of chalk, maybe 2 out there in a lineup. But I think for a majority of your plays, you should feel pretty ugly about the guys that you're using. So I think a good example of this, like a Siwoo Kim, he's not a player with a bunch of form heading in, but he's also like the lowest owned guy that we have here towards the top. I've got him at about like 12, just under 13% ownership, actually, there with his projected GPP ownership. If I'm going to take a shot on a guy that he really fits this golf course, he plays well at Pete Dye Designs, which, this, by the way, Sea Island plays like a quintessential Pete Dye design. I really like Siwoo at these sort of tracks. I can afford to get to him because he's not going to be mega chalk towards the top. Like an Aubert, I hate to pick on him because he is the best player that we have in this kind of field, but he's over 25%. But it doesn't even stop there. You've got some of these guys, and I'm just going to point out a whole bunch of them, but like a Thompson, a McCarthy, a Brian Harmon, a JT Poston, who outside of his win really hasn't played much at all here during the fall swing. There are a bunch of these kind of guys that are over 20% ownership. So I would say if you have 1, maybe 2 of them in your player pool, you can get away with that. In a few spots, you can take ownership out there in GPPs, but because I think some of the chalk this week is so fragile, mostly because they haven't even had recent form, but also because it's a fall series event, the chalk in these kind of golf tournaments are always going to be really fragile, really volatile to begin with, is you want to avoid a lot of those high-owned players. So I think a Siwoo Kim at like 13% would be a really good example of somebody that's a little bit more reasonable with the ownership, that if you're going to take a chance on, you do it with. Now, a Ben Griffin, I mentioned that he'd probably get some ownership this week. You can see that is the case there at about 19%. If I'm going to take actual ownership, like 19, close to 20% on one of my spend ups this week, I want it to be somebody that we kind of know what's going on with them. Like we've seen him for the last 3-4 weeks. It doesn't even have to be like he's played every event like you have there with a Ben Griffin, an English, an Eric Cole. like you can see there is our third core play. It doesn't have to be to that level, but I'd like to see them playing 2-3 times out of the last 5-6 weeks. Somebody like a Matt Wallace, for example, I give a little bit more leeway to because he's been playing on the DP World Tour. We can take a look at some of those finishes and get an idea for how Matt Wallace is playing. Like Luke Clanton, I hate to pick on him because I have one of my good buddies down here plays a lot of golf with Luke. I've only had the chance to do it once. I've played Fortnite actually with Luke Clanton before. Funny enough, yeah, I played video games with him. Funny kid, but I hate to really rag on him here. We have no idea what the hell he's been up to, right? He hasn't been playing in any of these sanctioned events. He had, I think, one other start this fall that we have stats for. His sample size on the PGA Tour has been amazing when we've seen Luke Clanton, but I think twice about using a chalky Luke Clanton when we don't have that same kind of form to go off of. So I think if there's one thing to do out there with your process, it's, as I said, just maybe try and get a little bit more different than what you guys are used to. And if you're going to take a piece of chalk, really be sold on it, is I guess what I would say there. I still like myself some Harris English. You can see I got on there at about 12.6%. I also like some Eric Cole at about 15% ownership. I wouldn't say that either of these two would be like low owned with these like 8K range players. But without giving you the exact ownership number, of course, guys, everything that you guys see blacked out here is posted over there on my Patreon page, linked in the description of the live stream. To go out there and check it out. But Luke Clanton, just to give you a little bit of a peek behind the Patreon curtain, is higher owned than what you have there with an Eric Cole or Harris English. So I'd rather take guys that we have a much better barometer on and that fit this style of golf course. In terms of your chalk, like trying to point out some of like the really popular players, I'm actually going to bring up the ownership on another tab just so that I don't have to do it completely off of memory. I also knew that we had a question about Bermuda grass putters, so I do just want to go back to that before I completely forget. A Mackenzie Hughes is getting a little bit more ownership than you would expect. I've got him at over 17%, so he's $8,800. He would be another chalky guy in that range. Towards the top end of the board, your highest owned 10K guy that's not Aubert, of those other two, Thompson is a little bit more chalky than you have with McCarthy. A Seamus Power, I have getting some ownership, but that 8K range, I mean, Clanton, a Mackenzie Hughes, as I mentioned, those would be some of your more popular players. There's not a ton of like 20%ers though. So like a Spawn, he's like 14%. I've got Glover at like 14%. Andrew Novak about 14.5% ownership. So there are guys down here in this 8K range that you've got to think twice about when it comes to the ownership, but no one that I would say is like egregiously high owned. So of those 4 or 5 guys that I pointed out, just to make sure that I point them out again for you guys, that'd be like a Novak, Glover, Spawn, Clanton. I'll include Eckroyd in that too. Eric Cole and Mackenzie Hughes. Of those like 5, maybe even 6 guys that we just pointed out, you can play a few of them in lineups. Like, for example, of those guys that we just talked about, I've got 3 of them in lineups this week. So it's not like I'm telling you to fade all of these guys that are going to be like 13 to 15% owned, but you shouldn't have every single one of them in your player pool, is essentially what I'm telling you. First off, you need to find leverage at some point. You've got to find places to get different against the field, also places to leverage against the field to actually move up those leaderboards. But these super chalky players, it's not like we're talking about a major championship sort of field where like maybe it's like a Joaquin Neiman that we're getting at like $7,000. I mean, this is Lucas Glover, and who by the way, I love Lucas Glover. Great iron player. I am always looking to play Lucas Glover out there in GPPs, but like it's not the same as getting like a legit stud player in a major at super cheap. You're talking about a fall series event, and these are, for lack of a better word, slapdicks in a lot of cases that are playing this week. So just don't fall into that trap. Try and be a little bit more cognizant about that ownership. And I think you guys will have a pretty good time with this week. Let's move on to a few other plays I wanted to point out. So a Doug Gim here at $8,000 would be the next player So he's about 10% owned. So he is getting some ownership, but not nearly as much as what I was thinking, because he's number 3 in the field when it comes to total motto ranking. He's at a very consistent, very solid fall swing, especially when it comes to his shots gained ball striking stats. So I thought he would probably be like 15 to 20%. In fact, I didn't talk him up as a value play because I thought that he would be mega chalky, and I kind of wanted to avoid that with all the plays I was talking about. But you can see at about 10.7%, he's far from overly chalky. So these kind of plays, I mean, honestly, a Doug Gim, if he was like 30% or like 20% owned, I probably wouldn't be using him because, as I just previously mentioned, like all these guys, I don't want to say all of them, but like in reality, all these guys are kind of slapdicks, right? They're not the best players out there on tour. I don't really want to play 30, 40% of anyone in this kind of field, but 20, 25% of a guy who the stats absolutely love, like I'll do that, or I'll play, 20, 25%. I think that's a lot more reasonable. Not dedicating half my portfolio to an absolute slappy. Like that's when it starts to get a little bit tough, when you're playing like half of your lineups behind somebody that you don't feel good about. We've also got Justin Lauer here. I thought he'd be higher owned than where I have him. So during my DFS preview, I talked about how he might be like close to 15%, and that he probably should be like 20, maybe 25% owned. Well, I've only got him at 8%. He's only $7,700, which, considering the kind of form that he's had lately, is, I thought, a huge misprice. That's why I thought so many people would be playing him here, especially because the golf course sets up the same way as what you had there for the Bermuda. So $7,700, you can see I bet him for an outright at 55 to 1. Like he's the kind of guy that I'll play this week, especially if he's only going to be 8% owned. Speaking of 8% owned, I get Daniel Berger here at about 8.6%. I have played him the last, I don't know, like 8 times that he's played on the PGA Tour. It hasn't always worked out, but he's always made the cut. He's been really solid for us the last few months, and I think he's got a big one in him here at some point. So you see the form loves him. He's number 5 in the field when it comes to recent form ranking, and $7,500. Yeah, he's sub 10% owned. Like that's the kind of level where, I'll take a guy. Like he's not sub 5%. There are some sub 5%ers here in the 7K range that you could get to for even more leverage. But I prefer the guys that are better plays that maybe are getting slightly higher ownership than that 5% mark that we mentioned, but that aren't mega chalky, that aren't well over 10%. So just to give you guys an idea of some of the guys that are a little popular there in that 7K range. So let me go over to the other tab once again, just to point that out. I got a Grayson Sig at like 16%, so I would definitely point that out as chalk. A Wesley Bryan is over 13%, so those are getting a little too chalky for my liking, at least. A Jacob Bridgman at over 13%, and Adam Svensson at nearly 12% ownership. A Keith Mitchell, he's 7,900, so he's towards the top end of that 7K range. He's just about 10% ownership out there in GPPs. So you've got a few guys, I guess, that are catching some steam, but I'm okay with the 6 to 8%er. So like obviously Daniel Berger was an example of one of the ones that I'll still play. But whether it's a Justin Lauer, who you guys saw there at about 8% ownership, and Ben Coles, I'll scroll down here in a second. He's about 7%. Same thing with Carson Young. Like I'm okay with those kind of ownership marks. Not so much like the 15, 16%ers down there in the 7K range. So we're just trying to incorporate as much game theory as possible out there into our lineups. And I think the 7K range, as far as I'm willing to go with ownership, is about that 8% mark with most players. And the reason for that, by the way, just to give you, why that's my cutoff point on a lot of these players, is 15 to 20% of one of these 7K slappies is digestible. Like, you play 20% of Berger, you feel pretty good about it. You play 15% of Gary Woodland, it's starting to stretch it a little bit, right? Like Gary Woodland hasn't been that consistent this year, but you can make 15% work. Like that's within reason, at least, where you're like, okay, it's only 15% of my lineups if he absolutely sucks this week, which, by the way, is well within these kind of guys' range of outcomes. However, you take like a Grayson Sig, and not to rag on my guy, because I love playing Grayson Sig. In fact, last week it worked out really well going out there and playing Grayson Sig for us at Bermuda. However, and it's a huge however, he's 16% owned out here for the RSM. you don't want to play 30% of Grayson Sig. And to get leverage, you're looking at 32, 33% right there. So that's why I prefer to take these guys at maybe 7, 8% at the very most, because that 15 to 20% mark just feels a lot more comfortable than that 30 to 35% that you need for leverage on some of those other players. And just remind, you kind of got to like, get some perspective sometimes. These guys aren't that good in this kind of field. So just, don't go too overboard, in my opinion, on any one play. Would be your best strategy here in the 7K range. You can see Carson Young there. He was another one of the outrights we talked up on the Tuesday video. I've got him at about 7%, which I will definitely play. Brendan Todd is at about 3% ownership here at $7,100. What I like about Brendan Todd is his course fit. He's a Sea Island guy, very familiar with the golf course, plays here pretty much every single year. And last week, he didn't have his best performance. He was also a lot more expensive, but he went from an 8K range player down to just $7,100. It's a similar course fit to Bermuda. Of course, he's won at Bermuda, so maybe that's why he was getting a little bit more steam, a little bit higher priced out there last week. But now he's way cheaper. It's the same kind of course fit. He loves playing over here in Sea Island, and he's 3% owned. So he's lower owned, he's cheaper, and it's pretty much the same course fit that you had out there for Bermuda. Like if you were going to play Brendan Todd last week in the 8K range at like 10%, then why the hell are you not considering him at $7,100 and at just 3% ownership? So you definitely have some diamonds in the rough that you can take down here. Not every value play of mine is going to be like over 5%, like you've seen with the first few that we've gone through. Some of them are going to be true diamonds in the rough, like you have there with a Brendan Todd. Still like Ben Coles, so 165 to 1 is the number that I got on him for an outright. So down here at $7,000, he's getting some ownership because of that form. But as mentioned, 7.4% is a little bit more doable than if it was that out over there in the double digits. In terms of some diamonds in the rough, we've got a Gsluke here at $6,900 a few weeks ago. And by the way, he had a few down performances the last few weeks. And if you saw my preview over there on Tuesday, I mentioned a whole lot about how the last few events didn't have shots gained metrics. And let me just show you what I'm talking about here, right? So we go down to Gsluke, who I believe, he was $6,900. Sorry, wrong tab there. That was event history. I want to find the course recent form over here, right? So he's missed the cut the last 2 weeks, Gsluke. So the reason I point this out is you would think that his form over the last 12 rounds would suck, right? That's pretty reasonable to think. If he's gone missed cut, 63rd, and then, okay, that T5 is pretty good. But this is the last, 8 rounds right there? He's gone cut, and then did nothing for 4 rounds at an event. And he's number 4 in the field in recent form ranking. You may say, like, how is that possible, Luke? Obviously, your rankings are wrong if he has a higher ranking, right? Well, kind of and kind of not, right? The actual answer is that no, they're not wrong, right? The shots gained metrics are based on actual shots gained metrics that we're getting from the PGA Tour. The reason why you could say it's wrong, though, is that those events didn't have the metrics, and he missed the cut at both of them. So clearly, his actual form the last few weeks isn't as good as what you see on paper over there, right? Well, I thought that because he was going to show up as really good in the modeling, you can see over here, right? He's number 4 in the field when it comes to recent form ranking, that he was going to be higher owned than what he was. I thought he was going to be like 5 to 7% because the stats lie, right? They make him look like a really good play lately. In fact, we go down here to his recent form, you'll see that he looks like he's an all-star, right? He's gaining across all 4 stat categories. Luckily, or say, I guess unluckily, right? People are a little bit sharper, I guess, than I was giving them credit for. And he's only 1.3% owned because he's gone missed cut. Well, I think that's concerning, right? You don't want guys that are just missing cuts, ideally. Like, we'd rather have a guy who's made 10 straight cuts heading in, like, for sure, right? We'd rather have the Scotty Scheffler form if we could find it. You're not always going to get that with the play, though. And just because he's had a few down weeks now, Gsluke is 1.3% owned. So, like, I think this is like the perfect buy low spot on that sort of player who just a few weeks ago was number 4 in the field when it came to his recent form. Sure, the last few weeks he's fallen off a little bit, but I like to remind myself of, like, hey, this guy was the, hot guy on the block just a few weeks ago. that everyone was trying to jam into lineups. So at $6,900, I'll forgive and forget a little bit, especially when it's somebody that was playing as well as he was. So just remember that about the shots gained metrics. They aren't as accurate as what you'd be hoping for. So if a player looks great on paper, there might be a reason for that. Just make sure to check their last few weeks and make sure it wasn't a complete disaster like it was for KH Lee. And then also we've got a Kevin Kisner here. And one more play we're actually going to talk about after that. But Kevin Kisner is starting to look a lot better. If you've been watching the last few events, especially last week at Bermuda, he's not only making cuts, but he's starting to make birdies. He's starting to get out there towards the top 25 of events. And if there's any course where Kevin Kisner can compete, it's a Sea Island. It's a really short track like you have there at the Seaside course. Even Plantation really sets up well for his game. And he's only $6,600, and it's supposed to be windy the first few rounds, which I think really benefits a Kevin Kisner. He's got that experience. He knows how to play in the wind. He's got a game that's well suited for playing in tougher conditions. And this golf course, Seaside course especially, can get pretty tricky when the winds start to kick up. I think that really plays into Kevin Kisner's hands. So he's only about 2% owned. He would be one of those lower owned diamonds of the rough that you're using for leverage. And somebody I'm using out there in GPP lineups. Not so much like single entries cash. Like I'm not going down to the 6K range very often when I'm playing in a higher dollar contest on DraftKings. But large field GPP, like big $5, big 15, 25. That's the kind of contest where I'll play a Kevin Kisner. That's where he would make sense. And then the last guy we're going to talk through here would be Robert Streb at $6,400. So he's 0.4% owned. And Robert Streb, if you've been playing PGA DFS for a while, he's first round led at this event like twice in the last 4 or 5 years. And it's not just this golf course. He plays well at Bermuda, plays well at the Sony Open. He plays well at the RBC Heritage. He plays well at every short course that we have on the PGA Tour. And there's a very obvious reason for it. He's complete shit off the tee. And I think he'd be the first person to tell you that. It's this clear weakness when it comes to his shots gained metrics. The one thing that Robert Streb is fantastic at is his Bermuda grass putting. So, in fact, I'm going to go ahead and sort this by Bermuda grass putting just so that we can knock that question out officially. So that would be column M. We're going to do it from largest to smallest so I can show you the best putters at the top. You can see Robert Streb, he's not at the top of this list, but he's gaining about a quarter of a stroke per round, which if you actually take a look at his shots gained metrics recently, it's actually been the problem for Robert Streb. He just hasn't been putting as well as what he's been used to. So on Bermuda grass, compared to his last 24 rounds, you can see he's about a half a stroke better per round on Bermuda grass than what he's been doing lately. So that's a reason to get to Robert Streb. But going up here to show you these top Bermuda putters, number one would be a Michael Thorbjornsen, who I'll just tell you right now, I am playing this week. He's also got relatively low ownership. There's Montgomery, there's Bridgman, there's Ben Griffin, one of our core plays. Denny McCarthy is always going to have some really good stats. There's Brendan Todd, as we pointed out a little bit before. You can see some of the other names on here. Obviously, the person that asked the question, you can pause this. You can see the entire list. But yeah, a lot of the guys that we mentioned, and there's a good reason for that. That's part of the reason why they project as well as they do at this kind of event. And that's the Agronomy situation that we have going on there too. So let me actually get back to the live chat, see if there's any specific questions, which by the way, if you have any specific players you want me to take on, just go ahead and let me know. And then we'll do some lineup construction a little bit after. You're going heavy Siwoo? I think it'll be at about 30%, Phil, but I like it. He fits these kind of tracks. What would I guess gaining 0.2 strokes putting would rank? 0.2? Well, 0.2 strokes would be somewhere around 70 over the first few days, right? It'd be just a little bit better than average. I'm not quite sure what you're asking, so maybe clarify for me just so I can give you the exact answer that you're looking for. But if you're talking about like on a single round, you gained like 0.2 strokes, you'd be like 70th out of the 150. So it's not exactly like 78. So not exactly half. That's going to be at 0 for shots gained, but it's usually pretty close to that. So if you're slightly gaining to the field, you're going to be slightly better than the average. So that's why I said around 70. Midpoint would be 78 in this size of field. Yeah, let me know if that answers your question. I'm not sure if it does. Slap dicks, you always kill you with that term. Yeah, it's one of my favorites for sure. And what's going on, Samuel? You're joining us a little bit late here, but I'd rather have you late than never. So hopefully you're having a solid night yourself. We're going to bring up Draftkings. We're going to build a lineup together to give you an idea of some lineup construction stuff. And I will circle back to the DFS sheet if you guys have anything in particular you want to talk about. But yeah, after this lineup construction segment, we're going to go through props and we'll be done with this thing. So I appreciate everyone tuning in as usual, showing all the love on the channel. I appreciate all that support, you guys. Smash the like button if you guys haven't already. That's the one thing I ask. And also subscribe so you don't miss any of the content to come. But in terms of our lineup construction here, what I really want to mention for a week like this is that just make sure that you're playing enough pivots. I mentioned before that if you're somebody that plays 2-3 pivots out there in a GPP lineup, just stretch it to 3 or 4. I think that with all these guys that don't have recent form heading in, that you're going to see a lot of ownership on bad plays, like just guys that are way higher in run than they should be because they don't have that kind of form. So what we're going to do here for this GPP lineup, this is going to be a lineup like for the big $25 GPP that you have this week, is we're going to get 4 pivots, and we're going to enter those into our lineup before we click anyone that really has ownership. So towards the top, I'm going to throw in a Siwoo Kim because I know he's like 13%, but he is a pivot compared to some of the other guys up top. 13% ownership, that's not really what makes somebody a pivot or a piece of chalk. It's their ownership compared to the guys around them. And comparatively, Siwoo Kim is actually low owned towards the top end of the board. Our second man in, going to try and find another play that is relatively overlooked. If we're going to do that in this 8K range, I guess Doug Gim would kind of qualify for that. Harris English would kind of qualify too. So you know what? We're going to go with Doug Gim just because he's a little bit lower owned than where I have Harris English. We're going to go into the 7K range now, and we're going to throw in let's go sub 5%er on one of these because I really want to hammer home the fact that just you don't need to be playing a whole lot of chalk. I think that's the one real edge that we can get during this fall swing. So we're going to go with a sub 5%er. Good example. Definitely stay away from Wesley Bryan, right? He's going to be like 13, 14%. If you're trying to get a little bit more different about it, that's for like a Brendan Todd. He can come in handy in that kind of range. And then towards the middle to top end of the 7K range, there's not a bunch that we actually have to choose from. And just to remind myself, I'm actually going to check my projections because there really aren't that many at all that we have towards the top end of the 7K range. We're going to use Sepp Straka actually, who he's not sub 5%. So he's not going to have as low ownership as like what we have there with Brendan Todd, but Sepp Straka is sub 10% owned. He's about like 7.5% in the last run that I ended up going with. So in this lineup here, you've got like a 13%er, a 10%er, a 3%er, and a 7.5%er. These are all pivots compared to the guys around them. Even if your last 2 players here had some ownership to them. So like, for example, if you went Ben Griffin, who's like 19%, your last man in at like $8,100. Let's say you played Novak. He's like 13% owned. You would get away with this kind of lineup because in 3-4 of your other spots, you were actively trying to get different versus the rest of the field. Now, I think optimally, if you can find another pivot to use as your last man in here, so maybe you go slightly lower owned and went to like a Keith Mitchell. He's a little bit lower owned than what you have there with an Andrew Novak. If you left some salary on the table and you played a Sam Stevens, who's like, I think he's sub 5 or 6% ownership over there in GPPs, then you could really get different towards the rest of the field. But you don't even have to go that far. Like if you rounded this off with Griffin, who's nearly 20%, and then Novak, who's pretty chalky himself there, you would even be able to get away with that out there in the large field GPP. So you want to embrace the game theory. You want to try and get different to give yourself opportunity for leverage, but you also don't want to overdo it. That's the other thing I really want to point out with going through this lineup construction is that, yes, we thought about ownership. We thought about leverage pretty much the entire time that we were building that lineup. But what you didn't see me do was take a pivot at all 6 spots. You can do that. I think the place to do that, I guess, would be large field GPPs. But if you're playing in like a single entry, you're playing like a smaller field GPP, let's say like rather than like 20,000 entries, it's like 1,000 or 2 entries that you're going out there and playing against, then you don't have to nearly as much about that ownership. In that kind of build, taking a pivot at all 6 spots would be pretty silly. I think you'd be way overdoing it if you did that in that kind of build. In those kind of contests, rather than having a pivot at all 6 spots, that's where 3 or 4 is just fine if you went with that as your pivot. So that's it for lineup construction. Just make sure that you're building your lineups for the kind of contests that you're entering. If you're entering the large field GPP, your lineups should look a whole lot different than if you were entering that out there in a single entry or a cash contest. So just incorporate that. You guys should have a good time out there with your exposure. And other than that, you just got to run good. You just got to hope that all of your guys play well. Hope that you get all the 6 of 6s through, that you don't get screwed by the weather over the weekend, that your guy doesn't withdraw out there before lock. Real simple stuff, right? Out here with PGA DFS to get all of that right at the same time. Obviously, I'm kidding about that. It's one of the hardest DFS sports that we have out there. But yeah, lineup building process, a whole lot easier than what you need to have happen afterwards. So just make sure you're building lineups with enough leverage. Make sure you're not duplicating yourself out there. And that's all we can do. Try and set ourselves up for success out there heading into lock. So I appreciate everyone stopping by for out there for all the DFS analysis. Now we're going to focus out there on the prop side of things. So if you were just here for DFS, I still appreciate all of you guys stopping by. Best of luck with all of your exposure there. And yeah, now it's time to get into the weeds here a little bit and get into some prop stuff. So I'm going to bring up Prize Picks. I'm also going to bring up at least the Draftkings and Fanduel boards so that I can show you guys some of the odds that they have up. And I have a few slips I've already entered, so we're not going to have to really do any line shopping here on the live stream. I'm more so just going to let you know what I'm doing for round 1, give you a little game plan. You can tell what I'm doing if you guys would like to out there on the prop side. But we have a little bit of a weather situation brewing. I don't think it's the most straightforward slate when it comes to conditions. So I've got a few things to talk about when it comes to that. And then we will go through at least 1 slip together, if not 2 slips over here on Prize Picks. So, and I'll actually bring up the stat averages as well. So that's probably a good idea for anyone that hasn't seen them quite yet. I know the Patreon members, they saw that over there on Monday, but I'll make sure to share the goods with you guys a little bit here too. Let's see. Okay, there we go. There are the averages. All right, so I've got the RSM averages up here and the Australian PGA. The Australian PGA has actually already started. I believe almost all the tee times are through already as well. So I don't think there's that much that we can really talk about for the DP World Tour. I will be looking at that for rounds 2 through 4, though, over there for my Patreon members. We're going to focus on the stuff at the top. So if you're just joining us, by the way, there are 2 golf courses in play. So don't be completely confused by that over there for Thursday and Friday. Thursday, Friday, golfers are going to play one course or the other. So if they start on Seaside on Thursday, they're going to have the Plantation course over there on Friday. On Prize Picks, they do have that actually marked for all the players in the field. So just to show you that, this SS right there, that means they're on the Seaside course. The Seaside course is a par 70. This PL over here, so this PL stands for the Plantation course, which is the other one that they have in play. So you can see Keith Mitchell right here would be a guy that's over there on the Plantation course. The Plantation course is a par 72. So there's going to be differences between the 2 golf courses, partially just because they're different pars from one another, but also because one has more par 5s. One is on the coast, as the name would indicate, out there with the Seaside. So you can see the different averages from golf course to golf course, which it's going to be a little bit of a headache, right? Trying to make sure that you're looking at the right stats out there for each course. But it does open up quite a bit of opportunity, as the lines makers have to do a lot of the same. And, you know, it's not like they're going to label the players wrong. Like, they're going to double check that before they open up the board. But sometimes they post incorrect projections when they have this kind of situation. So it's something that we've been able to capitalize there in the past. These averages, though, over here from 2023 are a little bit easier than what we're going to see here in 2024. The main reason being is that the wind is really going to kick up on Thursday. So if we go over here to the HRRR model, you'll see that tomorrow's wind gusts are going to get up to like 30 miles an hour in the afternoon. Now, they're starting around 10 a.m. local time. Actually, I think like 9:30 is the first tee time that you have. So they're going to be finishing the round really as these wind gusts start to get nasty towards like 30 to 33 miles an hour. But tomorrow it's going to be in the 50s in terms of temperatures, which is a lot cooler than what they'd rather have. Like if it's 60, 70 degrees, that would be normal this time of year. It's going to be a solid 10, 15 degrees cooler than what we would consider normal. And these winds, even the sustained winds, so that like 13 to 17 mile an hour range, that's a little bit more significant than what we saw last year. So the last year's scoring average, which by the way, if you go over here to last year, you can see pretty much all 4 days it played under par. In fact, like the weekend, it played really easy. It had like 3 under par both days. If we go back to 2 years ago, though, you'll see that the first day it actually played over par over there at Sea Island. So I don't think it's going to play the whole way over par, but I do think it's going to play a little bit harder than what you had last year. If I had to guess, scoring average is something like a half a stroke under par, maybe a whole stroke under par scoring average is what I would project for over there on Thursday. Either way, though, I don't want to say way harder than what you had last year, but significantly more difficult than what you had there in 2023. So the birdie average is probably going to go down a little bit. The bogey average probably going to go up at least half a bogey per round, if not an entire bogey per round over there on the Seaside course. And it's going to be a lot of the same over here in Plantation. The scoring average, it might be closer to even par over there. I do have to say, though, the Plantation course is a little bit further inland. So if we go over to the 2 years ago and I show you like the averages for round one, while it did play over par over here on the Seaside course, the Plantation course that same day, right, first round over there 2 years ago, it played 1.8 under par. So this is a tough dynamic. It changes every year. By the way, if you're just joining us, we went through even more data. It doesn't always work out this way, where the Plantation course is like way easier than the Seaside course when you have these conditions. But that is what we saw 2 years ago. The added caveat is if you want to go back to the beginning of the live stream, we do a full deep dive on it, though. If you go back to like 2011, 2020, there are examples where the Seaside course is easier when you have the windy conditions and the Plantation course is harder. So I do want to point that out because it's not always going to work out like what we had in this example. The whole point of this being, though, guys, I guess to give you guys the spark notes, is going to play harder, right? The question is, and the reason why I brought up that shit at the end, is that we don't know which course is going to be more affected, but we know that in general, scoring is not going to be as easy as what we had in 2023. So in terms of props that I was taking, I think if you take these birdie or better matchups, that you don't have to worry about the conditions as much, which is kind of nice when we deal with a slate like this. Like not having to worry about the conditions just makes our life a little bit easier in that kind of situation. But at the same time, I do think that you could fade a few players out there for tomorrow because those wins, I mean, they look kind of nasty. So I guess just to give you a few, like this Callum Turan, like he was a fade that I was looking at. And then for these birdie or better matchups, I was looking at this over on Ludwig Gobert. By the way, he's matched up against Adam Hadman, Adam Hadman's not a horrible player on tour, but Hadman is like an average birdie maker at the very best. Like he's like a number 70 on tour or something like that when it comes to his birdie or better percentage. Ludwig Gobert is a top 10 player on tour when he's playing his best golf, and he won at this golf course last year. So, by the way, all these matchups, they're playing the same golf course. So it's not like one's playing Seaside and one's playing Plantation course. There's none of that kind of funky business that we have going on. If Ludwig Gobert makes more birdies than what you have there with Hadman, he's going to go out here and win. Now, it's worth noting that they have these set up a little bit differently than they have in the past because they have this 0.5 on it. If they end up tying, so let's say that they both make 4 birdies, I'm pretty sure that Adam Hadman wins. I'm 99% sure that that's how they do it. But because they have this 0.5 on it now, it's not like 0 birdies or better. He actually has to go over for this to be greened out. He won't have a push if they have the same there. So this would pay 3x because you do have the one birdie or better matchup and then the one over there. And then another slip that you guys could consider would be this like over on Garrett Kago strokes. So by the way, Turan is on the Seaside course. -2 would be a push there at 68. Over here on Plantation course, -3 would be a push at 68 strokes. And he's another player that I'll fade with his kind of form heading in. So the pairing I'll give you for that one, there were a few birdie or better matchups that I liked. We'll go with this Ben Griffin one. There's a few others I have entered as well. But Ben Griffin going against Francesco Molinari. Ben Griffin's like a top 30 birdie maker on the PGA Tour. He's right around that range in terms of his ranking. Molinari doesn't even have full-time status, and he's lost more strokes to the field lately than he's gained in terms of his recent form. So you got Ben Griffin, who top 10 tier last year. He does have that 0.5 on him, just like the Aubert prop. So if they tie, I'm pretty sure he would lose. But because he is such a better player than Francesco, because he actually has solid form at this golf course, unlike Molinari, that's why I would take that kind of an over. So it is obvious that these like matchups are set up softer because they have them all at 0.5 now. But I think that they're set up way too soft in a few cases. Like the Aubert one, I think was the most obvious. Like he's just a lot better than Adam Hadwin. It's not so much that Hadwin's a bad player. It's that Aubert is like a top 5 player in the world. And then the same thing with this Ben Griffin one, right? Like it's not like Ben Griffin's a world killer, but he's like a top 30 player on the PGA Tour. Like I feel pretty good about that. Molinari is like washed up. He's like 40 years old. Like I hate to call that old, but for PGA Tour golfer, right? That's like getting up there. With your age, I'd rather have a young Ben Griffin who's actually a solid birdie maker. So hopefully it gives you an idea of some of the exposure I'm getting to. I think with this kind of forecast that fades, if you're going with strokes or birdies, or the way that I would shade towards it, especially because it's also only going to be like 50 degrees, like that's going to be pretty miserable to play in. And then these matchups, it's the first time I usually don't play these matchups, especially like I haven't played them out here with this 0.5 now, as opposed to like the 0 that they had before. I will be interested to see like how they work out there for the board. Is it going to be like a whole lot of overs that are hitting out here with these props? Or is it going to be pretty close to 50-50? We'll have to see how it ends up working out. So that's what we've got for the prop section. I'm going to see if there's any specific questions. If not, I'm going to hop on out of here. And by the way, just to show you some of these odds and show you like why I like the fades. Like, for example, Denny McCarthy is like -150 for his over on strokes. Now, I didn't fade him. He actually is at 67.5. If they haven't bumped him yet, yeah, you can see him here at 67.5. The reason why like we took Callum Tran or we took Garrett Kago is that they're like 0.5 higher. Like Callum Tran, for example, he's playing Seaside course. He's 0.5 higher, and he's a much, much, much worse player than what you have there with Denny McCarthy. So if Denny was at 67.5 and he was juiced over, like Callum Tran, I think even at 68.5, like even an entire stroke higher than Denny would probably be the same kind of odds towards the over, like -150 odds. So that's why I took guys like Garrett Kago. We went with Callum Tran out there for the fade as opposed to some of the other guys. Is it because I think they're even better sportsbook line value when it comes down to it? And yeah, even the sports books seem to think it's going to play a little bit harder because like you have these guys on Seaside course, like Denny, for example, who they have juiced over at 67.5 when the scoring average the weekend last year, we go back to that over here, 2023B, it was like 3 under par in the weekend. So obviously they think it's going to play harder than what we saw last year. Hence why I'm taking some of those overs. So let me see if there's any questions. If not, we're going to hop on out of here. Do I like Putnam? I think it's a good course fit. I don't know if I'd say I like him. Like he's not one of my top plays, but definitely an Andrew Putnam golf course. You're going heavy Mac Hughes as well. Okay, best of luck with you out there this week, Phil. Any birdie or better matchup bets that look sweet? Yeah, so those are a couple that I was looking at, Jordan, but there's a couple others I have on the Patreon page too. It's looking like that might be the best board that we have for round one. And is the 0.5 birdie or better matchups permanent? I'm not sure. And I've even got to say, like, I'm pretty sure that's how they're handling it with the 0.5. Maybe it's a mistake. Maybe if they end up getting the same amount of birdies, it will end up being a tie. But based on like the way that they actually have it like worded on the sports book, The 0.5 means that the tie goes away. So I guess we'll see if one of them ends up tying, what ends up happening. But I think it might be. I kind of like it though. Like I like the fact that you have actual good players going against guys that are clearly worse players. And now though, they actually have to get to that one birdie more. I kind of like that change. We'll have to see if they keep it permanent though. That's all I've got though out here for the live stream this week. Best of luck out there with all the exposure you guys are getting to. Go ahead, smash the like button if you guys haven't already, which first off, if you've gotten this far and you haven't already, what are you waiting for? Go ahead and knock it out there. But we're going to go out there, make it a week, hopefully make it one into the profit as well. Rounds 2 to 4, make sure to stop on by for the live streams as well. And let's go out there and find yourselves at the top of those leaderboards.